You know, one of the hardest things for a leader to do is to lead during a moment of crisis. Whether you are leading your family, your kids, in a car wreck, something that's happened, or you're leading in your community, maybe where a hurricane or a tornado has come through like we've seen terribly happen in Nashville not too long ago, or maybe something like the coronavirus, where you have, a virus spreading throughout the world at an alarming rate that has, a higher fatality rate than what we're used to seeing in a virus. How do you lead your organization through that? Whether you're a Fortune 500 or whether you're a small company that just has to put your salespeople out there. How do you do that? How do you lead through these times where a crisis comes in and it really tests us as leaders? It's not easy. I have been exposed to, like many of my sisters and brothers in the military, to a range of crises in my life. And, a couple come to mind in the context of this topic today, of leading through crisis, or really mistakes leaders make during a crisis. And I've made plenty. I've made plenty of mistakes in those moments. It's a human thing to do, I suppose. But in 2004, when we were in Afghanistan, one of my best friends, I was the operations center director. One of my best friends was a company commander who had taken several of his detachments into combat in a province in southern Afghanistan, southeast Afghanistan. And upon landing in Chinook helicopters, they landed into a buzzsaw. They were immediately hit from multiple sides. And what they thought was going to be a very specific surgical assault turned into something else, almost a Black Hawk Down kind of scenario where their helicopter, a CH-47 large transport helicopter, was literally shot out from underneath them. And it changed the nature of the whole thing now. We had a chopper down, we had pilots on the field, we had a change of mission because we had an inordinate number of forces that were pinned down, that had flown into a massive ambush. And now we were looking at a recovery mission inside our operations center, in our small tactical operations center that I had to manage along with my battalion commander. And I will tell you, there were a lot of things that happened in those moments as we heard that chopper was down, that we had people wounded, and this whole switch. But I'm not going to lie, I knew all of those guys on the field that day, but one of them's literally one of my very best friends in the world, who I'd gone through special forces training with for years. I started special forces with him, and that kept creeping in, and it was creating not only a distraction, but it was informing my behavior in such a way that wasn't necessarily helpful. And the way it manifested with me, at least initially, was I kept over communicating to him in the initial moments, trying to get feedback, trying to get updates, and just trying to let him know I was there. And what I really did was he said, "Brother, you got to give me space to work this." He had to call me off. And I realized in that moment that I had allowed my friendship, the fear of losing my friend, to kind of cloud that. And that's a little embarrassing to talk about to this day, but it is what it is. I heard him, I backed off, and I reassessed and I reoriented myself to start trying to work what I could control. Where could I be of value, of assistance to these guys now? Where could we be of value in the operations center, whether it was medical evacuation, bringing in close air support, notifying higher headquarters, whatever those things were. There were certainly areas where they needed our help. They needed me to be on my game, and that's what we did. This whole ordeal lasted, I'm not kidding, like 24 hours. Yeah, it was a long ordeal, and my friend was the last one to come off the battlefield. He did one more sweep of the area to make sure everybody was off. It was very, very, very late in the early morning hours when he finally stepped on a chopper and came off, and we got everybody out. Everyone made it out. We had some casualties, some wounded, but everyone made it off the field. And I look back on that today, and there were mistakes that were made, there were lessons that were learned, and I think that these are the kinds of things that we have to look at and talk about as leaders, not just military folks, not just law enforcement, but as leaders in today's environment, because look, we all face crises. As leaders, as organizational leaders, certainly, we live in a dangerous world. We may think we're super sophisticated and we've got everything going on, but as we're seeing today with the coronavirus, with 9/11, with natural disasters, there are active shooters. There are a range of things where life happens while we're making other plans, right, Wes?
That's absolutely right.
So how do we lead through those moments? And can we look at, the situations from the past where leaders made mistakes and learn from them? The military certainly does this. Special operations does this. Law enforcement does this. Why can't we do this as Rooftop leaders? Why can't we look at outside industry examples of crises and where leaders made mistakes in those situations and maybe did things right, but I think often we can learn from the mistakes. I told you that one of the mistakes I did was I overloved my buddy in the initial phases when he was trying to sort stuff out. That's a mistake, and I've got to learn from that, and I've got to be willing to share that with other leaders, and I do. I share it with my son who's about to become an infantry lieutenant. That's an important lesson, and I hope that he won't repeat that lesson. So I want to take a little bit of time today, and I want to talk, this vlog may go a little bit longer, but look, we're living in a time where hopefully as leaders, you're dialing into this, because if you haven't figured out that no one else is coming, did anybody wake up this morning and go, man, thank God for the media in Washington, D.C., because we're all over this corona thing, right? I didn't. And it's apolitical. I really try to stay away from all that. I'm talking about leadership that's in the interest of a higher purpose, right? I'm not talking about agenda or anything else. I'm talking about pragmatic, responsible leadership. Are you seeing that around you now? Are you seeing that show up? Are you leading that way? So I'm going to assume that maybe you're seeing some things that I'm seeing, which are no one else is coming. In many situations like this, where there's a crisis, we have to lead ourselves and we have to lead those around us. So let's have that conversation. And by the way, this is not me prescribing the mistakes that are made or how you need to lead through a crisis. I'm simply giving you observations I've made as a special operator throughout my life. And by the way, most of it was observations of other super courageous souls who led. I took good notes, but I would be irresponsible if I didn't share those lessons, right? And the other thing is, there are a lot of people who are going to watch this vlog who have had tremendous experiences, good and bad, in a crisis. Please post them in this vlog. Put them in here, things you've learned. Let's keep it focused on what we can teach each other about mistakes that were made. What greater good can we give in a situation like this, right? So here's a few, no certain order, but they kind of tie to that particular event I talked about with the downed chopper, but they're universal singulars. I think you can find value in them. And again, I'm characterizing them as mistakes I've seen made. They were made that day, but also I've seen them show up again and again and again, okay? So the first one is an overreaction to the event. Right? When something happens in our life as a crisis, obviously we need to sort out the immediate threat and we need to figure out if we're safe, right? Because that's what the amygdala does in our brain, that's primal. But then once we do that, like I said in the other vlog, step back and really, take an assessment and attune to your environment, right? Too many leaders these days are overreacting in the moment way too soon. And what happens when we do that as leaders, we take ourselves out of the fight. We take ourselves out of relevance when we overreact, right? We're no longer credible. We've overextended, we've overreached, and now we're in the mix, in the churn so deeply that we become emotionally invested and we can't lead, right? So that overreaction is a super dangerous thing, and we've got to work on that, and we've got to have surrounded ourselves with people who will call that out, right? The next thing that I see happen is there's too much invested in the first report. In the last vlog, I talked about the first report is always wrong. That was one of our principles in our operations center, and we had them posted. The first report is always wrong. It doesn't mean you don't take it seriously. It doesn't mean you don't stop what you're doing and everyone focus on that report. That has to happen. But then we need to realize that the folks that are rendering the report are in duress. They don't see the full picture. They can't, right? So we need to know that more facts are going to come in. Some things will be irrelevant. Some things will go away. Some things will emerge. But at that moment, when a crisis, when we're alerted to a crisis, we need to recognize that the aperture is going to grow over time, and we need to feed the process bottom to top, top to bottom, side to side, that is going to allow that picture to grow so that we all see the same picture. That is one of the most difficult things to do in a crisis. But if we can, if the person closest to the crisis, all the way back to the resourcing or authoritative agent, can collaborate on what they see and speak to each other, oh, it's a whole different ballgame. Do you see that going on a lot these days? Do you see that happening around? I don't. So take control of your own organization and see if you can put that in place, because fear is contagious, but so is leadership. All right? The next thing is, I think that we go inside our heads too much as leaders. I know I did when I got those words about Lynn. I did when I got that word about my dad. It's a natural human thing. But what are the actions we take in the moment to get out of our head? I'm going to do another vlog on that can help you think about that. But we've got to get outside of our head. By that, I mean we can't be consumed with all the churn that's running through. We've got to step away from that, and we've got to focus on the people around us and get outside of ourselves. And if we can do that, then we start to become relevant and relatable again. If you're in your head in a crisis, you look like you don't trust yourself, because you don't, and then no one else is going to trust you, and they're going to panic. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, Wes? Okay. The next thing I see help it happen a lot, and it's happened to me, is in a crisis, we rely on instinct instead of skill. Now, hear me on this. In an initial moment of crisis, if there's an immediate threat on you, instinct is everything, especially if instinct is informed by training, right? But once you've ascertained that you are not an immediate threat, but others are, whether it's a collapse of the market, or whether it is an angry customer, or whether it is someone in your organization's family member has been killed, right? Once you've ascertained that the immediate threat is not around you, but it's out there, right? Then I think it's absolutely important that we rely on our training and our skill. We cannot rely on instinct in those moments. You can trust your gut, but we've got to invite the training in that we've done, and hopefully you have. Hopefully you're watching these vlogs. Hopefully you're doing contingency planning. Hopefully you're talking through things like in the military. In Vietnam, casualty notifications were atrocious. Taxi cab drivers would deliver them to family members. It's horrible, right? But over time, the military wised up and developed a notification process that post 9/11 is astounding. Within 72 hours, I think, maybe 48, the family member is notified. No news broadcasts go out ahead of time. It's a lockdown on the base. How do you think that happened? Well, they trained on it when the sky was blue, and then they leveraged it when the storm clouds rolled in. Do you see what I mean? They didn't rely on instinct and emotion when a casualty came in. They could not. They had to rely on solid training that they had done before the event. Okay? So that's super, super important. Another thing that I see is I see leaders in a crisis, they pull back. They pull back, and it's really dangerous. It's really, really dangerous when you do that. You cut the trust levels off with your people, and now they don't feel trusted. You micromanage, kind of like what I did with Lynn in those initial moments. I micromanaged him, and I needed to trust him to shape the situation and then report back, and for me to trust him and to do where I could affect things. I'm going to end it right there because I have a few more to give to you guys, right? We're going to make this another part of the vlog, so you're going to have to tune in next week to watch part 2 of this, of the mistakes leaders make during crisis, because I think it's important for us to have this conversation. And again, please, as a reminder, those of you who have been through crisis and you've seen mistakes made or best practices, please come in here. But this is a collaborative forum where we can really work together to talk about leadership at the organizational and people level where we live, okay? Because no one else is coming. Thanks for what you do. I'll see you in the second installment of this one, Mistakes Leaders Make During Crisis. I'll see you on the rooftop.